Welcome to the Qualified Tutor Podcast. I'm your host, Ludo Miller, and I'll be interviewing tutors and thought leaders from across the tutoring landscape to inspire, inform, and motivate you to become the best tutor you can be. The Qualified Tutor Community is a safe and supportive space for tutors who love to learn and grow. We offer training, resources, ideas, and a chance to connect with like-minded tutors. If you'd like to continue the conversation, join our Qualified Tutor Community at www.qualifiedtutorcommunity.org or find it in the show notes. Welcome to the 18th episode of the Qualified Tutor Podcast. We are very excited today for the conversation that we are going to be launching with our guests here. We are heading for the ever successful roundtable format that we've used several times on the Qualified Tutor Podcast so far, which allows us to share ideas and build discussion. We're hoping to give our listeners a deeper understanding of how learners think and feel, and how the work of Lee Elliot Major that we have on our podcast today in social mobility can be reached via improved standards in education and tutor and teacher training. Lee is a number of things. He's a keynote speaker, a published author. We are avid fans of what works, by the way, Lee. And a columnist who's been spearheading the movement to address this country's low social mobility and unequal educational landscape. Lee has also formerly been chief executive of the Sutton Trust, with whom we are working closely to provide tutor training and support, and is the professor of social mobility at the University of Exeter, where, interestingly, actually, both of my brothers have studied and are studying. Importantly, this is the first position of its kind in the field of social mobility, making Lee a real pioneer and a leading voice in this area. We also welcome Adrian Conway and Julia Silva. Adrian is our course facilitator and director of NPQ Online and Neon Learning. Adrian has 30 years of teaching experience, with 20 years in schools in areas of social deprivation. Julia is, as listeners of this show and our QT community well know, is deputy head teacher of a girls' school in North London and is the amazing founder of Qualified Tutor. So welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us, Ludo.
Thank you for having me.
That's not a problem. Lee, we'd love to start with the question that we often kick our podcast off with, as we feel that it really it gives an insight into our guests and their work and experience. So, Lee, what kind of student were you, and did you ever have a tutor?
So this is a really interesting question, really good question to start with, I think, because I dropped out of school. And I don't know if you've seen the newspaper articles on this, but there's these pictures of me with eyeliner and blonde spiky hair from the 1980s, which my children find hilarious now, my teenage children. And I sort of say to them, I was once a sort of trendy young thing. But my mum and dad split up when I was around 15, 16. I lived on my own in London. I won't tell you the whole sob story, which I do when I give talks. But partly I do tell that story because I was the first person in my family to go to university. And it was a turnaround for me because I did drop out of school for various reasons. And when I say drop out of school, I didn't do I failed to finish. So I'd done my O-level. I'm old enough to have done O-levels, and I'd started my A-levels. And effectively, in the second part of my sixth form, I just stopped going to school. So I retook a college. This is all in West London, where I'm from. I'm from Feltham, which I say is famous for the Young Offenders Institution there. And one day I plan to go back, actually. Not that I actually went to the Young Offenders Institution, but to go back to Feltham and do some sessions there. So this is a long story, but basically teachers helped me enormously. So I remember because the school had seen me as an Oxbridge potential applicant. I ended up going to Sheffield University and had an amazing time. But at this point, they were pushing me to do natural sciences at Cambridge. But in those days, you had to have, I think, Latin. There was some reason why. So I had an amazing tutor who tutored me in Latin because the school didn't provide it at the time. And I look back on it now, and I have big regrets because he was amazing with me. And I think we might come on to this, both in terms of providing emotional support. Having someone who believes in you, actually, who's an expert in their field, is, for me, was an amazing thing to happen at a time where I didn't have much support in my life. Sadly, I stopped doing that. I dropped out of school. This is when it all sort of started to go belly up for me in some ways. But, you know, teachers were very supportive of me, and I sort of remember that fondly. And now when I have these big debates about how far teaching should be about social welfare as well as core teaching, I think schools during the COVID crisis have been under huge pressures to become effectively centres of social sort of welfare. I always think back to my life, and to be frank, if it wasn't for teachers and tutors helping me, I would never have got back on track. But now I have concerns about how much we expect from teachers, actually, because I think there's only so much they can do. So sorry, that's a very long answer, but yes, I did have some tutoring.
Good. Well, that's very positive. Good to know that had a positive experience, and we are well aware here of Qualified Tutor of the link and the relationship between tutor and teacher, and how that supports the students' overall well-being. Is that right, Julia?
That's right. And we also very we notice in these question patterns because everybody who comes onto our podcast talks about having been an enthusiastic student and an able student, and our vision over here is to be able to help them to take those abilities and pay them forward to younger students behind them. So I think what we wanted to start off with asking you, Lee, was about the evidence and your vision for how tutors can make a big difference to students' life outcomes, because that really sums up a great part of your work historically. And if you can sort of share with us the evidence basis, because that's where you're coming from in your grounding with your work with what works and your meta studies, but also the big picture of how tutors can make that difference. I think that would be a really powerful way to start this conversation.
So just to bring it back a little bit, because I'm a professor of social mobility. So, and I think one of the things about these debates that I think is important to remember is that education can't solve everything, right? So in the bigger debates, I think as a country, we need to think about inequalities more generally in wealth, in income. And again, that's interesting for me, because a lot of schools are almost getting into that area of providing free school meals or breakfast. You're almost getting into the area of addressing wider inequalities. So I think it's important to put education in context of that, because I think tutoring and teaching can be transformative for young people, for all people actually. But as a vehicle for social mobility, there's only so much you can do if you're not going to tackle wider inequalities. I think it's just an important point to make. So within education, I've spent many years sort of writing books, as you know, and articles and giving lectures about what we think are the best bets for learning in the classroom. And it is in the classroom, by the way. So there's a lot of talk normally from politicians, but also I see some school leaders talking about as well, about school structures and things like selection versus mixed ability grouping, whether we use teaching assistants or not, all these sort of bigger issues. Actually, when you look at the evidence, the thing that matters most is teaching, is the interaction between pupils and their teachers or tutors. And so we know that. I just think it's very hard to do, right, in some ways, consistently well. And that's, for me, one of the biggest questions of education always comes back down to that. And I think we get distracted by lots of new ministerial statements, new initiatives, when really the key issue for me is teacher-pupil interaction and how we promote learning. So within that, I think, what we know is that, of course, tutoring done well can have huge impacts on learning. So on average, the famous toolkit we produced for the EF and Sutton Trust and the book What Works, available in all good bookshops, we found on average it was about 5 months extra development for a child over a year. There's all sorts of assumptions in that translation of effect sizes into months development, but roughly it's around that. That within that figure, there is a huge variation. Of course, it has to be done very well, and what do we mean? We might get into that a bit more in this podcast, but a few things I would just say, that for me there is it's not just about a transactional thing where you're just revising, for an exam. It's not just. I don't like the term cognitive versus non-cognitive. There's a lot of debate within education about this. For me, the emotional, or if you can call it that, side is as important in a way as the cognitive side, if we're going to use that term. So when you look at a lot of the evidence around learners, a lot of it is around confidence, self-esteem. So a good tutor or teacher is thinking about that, as well as, how well are they doing in their maths and how much are they becoming an independent learner. So one-to-one, particularly, but small group as well. And when I give talks to teachers, I always say, think about small group teaching as well, because that can be as effective, and often it's more fun actually, because you've got feedback happening between the pupils. So we've known about this for a long time. The thing that there's always been a challenge is, how do you enable this to happen? Because it can be quite costly, because you're having one adult with that pupil. Last thing, and I'll hand over back to you. I think the other thing that what was interesting is the bigger impacts are with teachers or former teachers on average. But we now know there are programs that have used teaching assistants, and we've had very good results. And more recently, there are charities that are using models that use undergraduates or graduates. And I think in a very focused way, they can be effective as well.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lee. Can you go deeper into what's the difference between those most effective tutoring models? Because everywhere that you talk about the power of one-to-one tuition, you use this caveat of expert tutors, of expertise in tutoring. And we know now that the government is going to be contributing funding towards helping schools to make use of the power of one-to-one tutoring. But we know that not all... The way that we say it is that there's more to tutoring than meets the eye. And that if we can really unpack what works in tutoring, teachers need all sorts of crowd control methodologies that tutors don't need to learn. But there are specific elements of pedagogy that we really, really need to be very directed with to equip our tutors to make the biggest difference for students. So in all of your work in the teacher toolkit, which we make use of in our courses, we really focus on feedback, on self-regulation and metacognition. And what we try to do is give tutors a sense that there's grounding and there's evidence and there's a science as well as an art to tutoring effectively. So if you could sort of give us some of the specifics, some of the how, because you use this lovely phrase, the Bananarama phrase, don't you? It ain't what you do, it's the way that you do it. So we really come from, in our training, we really start with culture, and we use Simon Sinek's Golden Circle to talk about the why of a tutor initially. But then we make sure that we move on quite quickly to the how and the what, because we need to make sure that our tutors when they're sitting face to face with a new student, know what to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's great to hear all that because I think there is this notion of tutoring being quite a simple, almost, as I said, transactional thing that's associated with private tutoring as well. It's associated with immobility, social immobility in some ways, right? It's as one of I think the What Works book that we produced does go into some of these areas where we looked into what makes great teaching. There's another report I was involved in, and some of the things we found there relate to this. So we found that, and it might not surprise practitioners that it was really pedagogy. It was content knowledge. There is a certain amount of pedagogical content knowledge you need, and what I mean by that is not just being a PhD in something in a subject. It's knowing, for example, the misconceptions that come up time and time again among pupils in particular areas. I've got very interested in that because it can be quite predictive of good progress, is if you have teachers who are really knowledgeable about misconceptions. I think a session on professional development on that would be really, really good. So it's content knowledge, but also instructional techniques, if you like. Those are the two areas. Now, as you say, behaviour management, all other things do contribute, particularly to classroom teaching. But those two key areas, the evidence always comes back to. The other thing I would stress with this, and I've become obsessive with this, is sort of feedback for learning, and how do you enable the learner to become an independent learner. So one of the things I worry about with tutoring is a dependency culture that's created. So if you have tutoring that is not sophisticated, it can lead to the children or the young people, whoever you're tutoring, becoming dependent on thinking that every time they need to learn something, they need someone to help them with it. A good teacher or tutor is finding ways to get feedback from their learner to urge them to become more of an independent learner. So knowing where your pupil is in their learning journey and giving appropriate feedback, whether that is content based, whether it's right or wrong, or whether it's about enabling them to think about the strategies for how they approach a problem, or is it about them as a learner, whether they are being, metacognition and self-regulation. And that is a really skillful thing, right? All the teachers and tutors I speak with say, Lee, yes, we do feedback. And then when you observe the classroom or the tutoring, you find that we're all, and all of us are prone to this. It's much more difficult than it sounds. And I would actually say more feedback, less teaching in some ways, in the sense that, I think sometimes we, and I count myself in this as a profession, you spend too much on the initial articulation of what you're trying to explain and too little on getting that feedback loop created. And finally, what I'd say on feedback, I really stress it's really thinking about how feedback how that actually comes from the pupil back to the tutor. It's not, a lot of people think of feedback as the teacher or tutor giving some specific feedback to the pupil. It's really, for me, a two-way process. It's really about how the feedback lands, both in terms of the pupil giving you information of where they are on their learning journey, and then you adapting your tutoring or teaching in light of that evidence. It sounds so simple, but it's so easy to get wrong.
I think quite often what you see in schools is or in tutoring indeed, is that the feedback is a process. So it's as you say, it appears to be a one-way street. Where the feedback's being given to the student. But the important part really is what you're saying is actually what happens next. It's what happens with that feedback and how that interaction then takes it forward.
I think one-to-one for me is a way of making teaching as efficient as it possibly can be. I think Bloom once said this, actually, that, if, a lot of my work in the meta studies that you mentioned, and I have to mention my colleague, Steve Higgins, who's amazing, by the way, my co-author, Durham University professor. You should talk to him at some point if you can get him. But one of the things he's brought to this is the very rigorous comparative analysis of what types of approaches have most impact or effect size. And some of the stuff that Bloom did, he argued in one of his books, that one-to-one tutoring gives you the highest rate of learning that you can aim for. It's very difficult to get there as a classroom teacher because you've just got so much other things going on. Some teachers can do it. I mean, some of them are, you watch them and they are absolutely amazing at this. And I think we don't respect the art and science of teaching as much as we should do as a society, actually. That really frustrates me. The more research I've done on this, the more you realise how amazing it is. I think it's one of the most amazing things we do as human beings. But yet it's, there was, I'm not going to mention any names, but one of the ministers recently, there was some remark about having desks all pushed, all facing the front. And you get these sort of quite naive comments made by both parents and politicians and others about what I think is one of the most sophisticated things in the world. How do you promote learning in another human being? Anyway.
It's fascinating because we've all been in school, and so ministers all have opinions about what their experience was, don't they? And that's what they're reflecting back on. But one of the things that we've noticed with school lockdown is that parents don't relate to their children as learners. And we've certainly seen lots of parents in our school emailing and saying, oh, now I see what you mean, because they actually haven't had that view of their children. And so although
there was a sort of lot of, in the early lockdown period, I think most parents now are fed up with it, but I was really worried. I tried to write a piece in the newspapers about warning parents not to try and be tutors or teachers, and to help their children and give them some stability and some support. But there was a lot of articles about how to be a tutor in your own home. And I think a lot of parents have realised just how difficult it is, actually.
Yes. And the damage that you can do if you're tutoring with stress and pressure. We talk a lot.
You tend to go to, I've seen this a lot, to task completion. It's why homework is very variable. And indeed, for primary schools, we think on average it has very little impact whatsoever. Partly that's because a lot of parents cheat. That they basically do the homework for their children because it's a weird thing that their children are almost representing them at the school, so they want to look good. There's all sorts of interesting psychological dynamics in the home.
Tutors do it as well sometimes. Those lazy tutors, Lee, who just sit there with a past paper or the homework of the students. So let's not lump this all on parents.
Yeah, no, that's very true. I think, by the way, that's another area which is very interesting for me, is whether teaching or tutoring is about exam preparation or what I call deeper learning. And I think a lot of the market in tutoring, and I've seen very good tutors get involved in this, is really about exam test preparation. But anyway, that's another, I think, dynamic in this area.
Ludo's really passionate about this. We love the role of a mentor within the role of a tutor.
Yeah. I think there's a whole another discussion there to be had about how the education system is set up and how we direct students towards passing exams, and you talk about this a lot in your works and the talks that you've given about focusing on the exam just cuts off the wider education of the student.
I think there's going to be a really interesting dynamic over the next year. There's a consultation out now. I don't know if you saw from Ofqual, and the assumption at the moment is that there will be full exams, A-levels and most GCSEs next year for a group of learners who have had devastating learning losses. And so I really worry about that cohort coming through. It's about 1 million children who, at the moment, it appears, are going to be expected to do full exams. I think that, for me means next year a lot of it will be test prep, and it's going to scar maybe a generation of children. So that's worries me,
especially at an age where mental health is a crucial issue in secondary schools.
Absolutely, I really worry about that national policy. I'm going to say something about it soon, but I just think we need to be a bit careful with that group of children.
That's right. Yeah. I attended a Teach First webinar a couple of weeks ago, and the heads there was talking about being cautious of a deficit language. So if we're talking to the students about you missed out and you lost out, then they will always feel like they're playing catch up with a cohort ahead and behind them. And if we rather talk about getting back into learning, then how much more focused on the long process of learning. So I'm actually going to pull out another quote from this lovely book, which I've been reading. And it says exactly that. It talks about lifelong learning in a globalized knowledge economy will make the worlds of work and education indistinguishable. So that's an amazing vision where learning just overspills right out of school. But at the same time, school work can sort of overspill into school, and you can have a much more real skills approach to teaching and learning, because academics are wonderful, but it doesn't stop there. And if you think about how fast the adults have had to learn different ways of working during lockdown, you could completely reframe it for this cohort and say, you've been surrounded by adults who have modeled learning for you. And so many things have been accelerated. So rather than talking about what they've lost, we could totally reframe it and talk about what they've gained.
Yeah, no, I do. I mean, a lot of the rhetoric has been around catch up, hasn't it? And yeah, no, and I have played to that as well, to be honest with you, just because I wanted to influence policy. So you think, okay, if the government want to catch up, I'm going to give them some ideas around that. But I do take that point. I think you've got to be really careful with your language. Again, that part of being a good teacher and tutor is thinking about language, isn't it? Very, very, very carefully. But yeah, no, I think post-COVID, there's some really interesting debates to be had. When we did that book, Social Mobility and Its Enemies, one of the weaknesses that we perceived in the international comparisons was the link between work and education. And I think, there's going to be a lot of young people in the workplace needing training, new learning. So that's, and we're not very good as a nation actually in providing support for learners who don't go through the academic route. So there's lots of, and by the way, I get lots of undergraduates who are at very prestigious universities, including the University of Exeter, who have told me that their peers are getting tutored now. So even at undergraduate level, there are students getting tutors. That worries me a little bit, because I hope that that's being done, in a way that's around, again, proper, what I'd call deeper learning, and not just getting past that, degree exam. But anyway, there is a sense in which if you go down the academic route, there are options there in terms of hopefully some very good university teachers as well. But if you go down the sort of more workplace route, which let's face it, is nearly half of over half the population, there's not that culture of learning that you see in other countries. For example, in Germany, there's a very much a long-term sense in the workplace of how do we develop our employees. So one of the proposals I have for the government, and they have said they want to be radical on these things, is a sort of lifelong learning levy, where maybe a bit of money for some people who don't go through the academic route for their training, learning, and you would be able to use that at a later age. It's not necessarily just under 25 or whatever. I think some people actually, in fact, we're all like this, aren't we, really? We're all lifelong learners in theory, aren't we? So I'm very interested in that. Last thing I'd say on this, sorry, I know I'm talking too much, is the country suffers a real basic skills deficit as well. And I use that word. And compared to other countries, we have far more young people who leave school without basic literacy or numeracy, and you see that in the adult population as well. So I worry about that. That's a different maybe challenge, but that's an issue for the country.
Bloom's 2 Sigma shows Bloom's 2 Sigma problem compares conventional learning with mastery learning and tutoring. And it shows that tutoring creates mastery because the tutor doesn't move on until the students understood the material. And the problem with conventional learning is that it leaves gaps because the teacher always has to move on because she's keeping track of a curriculum that is a top-down thing. It's not really following where the children are up to. So it's quite interesting to think about functional skills and how much more effective it would be to teach functional skills on a one-to-one or small class basis, even if history and geography and science and arts and drama and PE would be taught in a bigger cohort. If you could have a track where the functional skills are delivered in one-to-one or small groups, you'd have mastery consistently.
Yes, I mean, I agree with that. I mean, yeah, one of the things that I think, again, post-COVID for schools in general, they're going to have to think about is not only the balance between, face-to-face versus online learning. And for me, it always comes back to learning. What are the aims that we're, so how can we utilize the technology or online aspects of this? Sometimes I think teachers get excited by the technology and then you sort of start thinking, well, what's the actual learning question here? I think the other thing for me is how schools manage the boom in tutoring, and we might come on to this National Tutoring Programme that the government has announced. But for me, again, there's an interesting challenge for schools is how do you utilise this resource that you've got, and it sounds like a lot of money. By the time you give that to every school, it ends up not being much. But, how can you utilise one-to-one and small group tutoring alongside face-to-face classroom teaching? For me, always come back to what the learning intentions are, and then think you can think about it. But sometimes we get it the other way around.
Do you think, Lee, that sometimes we look at these problems from the wrong side? We look at it from what we want to achieve rather than the starting point of the children, really.
Yeah, I'm particularly obsessed, as you know, with disadvantaged pupils as well, and one of my worries with the boom in tutoring, private tutoring over the years has been, that it's predominantly a middle class affair. That the data on that suggests that, and it sort of bears reason, doesn't it? That those families with the money are going to be investing in that. So I worry from a disadvantaged pupils. And when you look at feedback in the classroom, and I think most teachers are passionate, by the way, in terms of social justice. Most of them, because they're not being paid lots of money they should be paid more, by the way. But I think if you look at feedback in the classroom, too often you find there's a famous book by Graham Nuttall, which if you haven't read the Hidden Lives of Learners. I don't know if you guys have heard of that. Nuttall was amazing. I think he inspired all that, the John Hattie stuff, really. But he did this amazing research where he looked at children in classrooms and actually videotaped them, recorded them, and painstakingly sort of reported on what children were actually doing. And what we found, or what Graham Nuttall found, he's passed away now, but it is that I think it was something like 80% of the time children are pretending to listen. I always do this when I do sessions with teachers. I always say, you've got to guess the proportion of time spent pretending to listen. 80% seems a really big number, right? But that's from a study in New Zealand from quite a time ago. But I do think too often it's the disadvantaged learners at the back of the class who are very adept, and by the way, who are very talented in many ways, and they've just sort of decided that this isn't for them, and they're nodding their heads. And too often, if you don't have backup with one-to-one tutoring, you're going to lose those children in the learning. And once they fall behind, you'll all know this, it's very hard then, particularly if they don't get the foundational sort of basics in subjects.
It makes me think about that amazing book, Unequal Childhoods, Annette Lareau, and how she follows families in America, a fly on the wall study, and she watches to see different parenting styles, and she finds that there's really only two parenting styles. There's the leave them to it parenting style, and what she calls the concerted cultivation parenting style. And in that concerted cultivation, she gives one example where the child is taught to advocate for himself to the GP. So the mother prepares him on the drive to the GP to explain what's hurting him. Whereas those other children are not taught to advocate for themselves. They're taught to expect the system to be against them. And if you put that study alongside the developmental studies about the power of each back and forth in a conversation. So speech and language development happens that each time a person replies to the last person in a conversation, the number of back and forths is where the learning happens. And so if you put together those models where, especially during lockdown, if children have been in front of the TV for 8 hours a day, if they haven't been conversing, then their oracy skills are going to be depleted. And there's going to be a massive discrepancy between the children who have had that input during lockdown and they've been gardening and baking, and the children whose parents weren't able to give them that input for a variety of reasons. And therefore, that disparity is going to grow. And if you bring it right back to tutoring, well, a tutor is speaking to you directly and will wait for you to reply. So there's nowhere to hide. And if you think about Teach Like a Champion, where he talks about how one of the things that you must do with children is not let them off the hook. So if you ask them a question, you help them to get the answer, because otherwise they're left completely disenfranchised. They didn't succeed. So
I think that's fascinating.
No, it is fascinating.
I mean, the things I'm doing, I proposed a research project that hopefully will get the foundation to support, an American foundation, which is looking into private tutoring. And one of the questions, there's many questions we want to look at, but one of them is the motivations of parents in this, to understand that a bit more clearly. And in the social mobility literature, we talk a lot about, it's not tiger parents in Britain. We call them panther-like in Britain because they invest a lot in their children, but they don't want anyone else to know about it. It's sort of my child happens to be a natural scientist, actually behind the scenes, they're doing all this extra tutoring. But I find that notion of the different parenting approaches interesting, because I think, one of my hypotheses in the social mobility debate is that you're getting extremes now. You're getting some parents who I think are unhealthily promoting their children, and their children become a sort of a proxy for success again, and they end up sort of going to very prestigious universities and doing very stressful jobs because their mum and dad wanted them to be successful in that way, and it's almost gone too far the other way. So you have to be careful, I think, in you want parents to support you and encourage you to advocate for yourself, but you don't want to go too far. So it's getting the balance right.
You almost need to recalibrate what success means, don't we, really?
You do.
Because it's different for every person.
It is. And I think this is a debate for another time, perhaps, but I think in this country, we bought into the very individualistic success, but particularly influenced by the American culture. I don't think, and it's been interesting during COVID, actually, because people have started saying, yes, nurses and teachers we really value. Let's see what happens if that continues after we get out of this. But yeah, I think we've all got trapped into, I'd love to talk to you more about this. We could talk all day about it, but a very materialistic, individualistic notion of success. And I worry about that, actually, because I think it's not good for social mobility.
I've got to pick up on that word proxy. Sorry, Ludo. I know this is the best conversation that we've had on this pod. I'm bubbling over with excitement. But you mentioned the word proxy, Lee, and I think that one of the things that we've seen here that's been so remarkable is this thing that John Hattie showed us, that learning is invisible, and people. Well, teachers and tutors learn to see learning, don't they? They learn to find ways to see that the children are making progress and to read the learner's mind, really. And parents don't have that skill. or they struggle to have that skill. And so they use proxies like exams and outcomes and universities because they can't see the learning itself. And if you think about your evidence about self-regulation and metacognition, well, that's when we learn to feel our own learning. And all of these things that we're creating around it are distracting us from that real understanding of the lifelong learning journey. And so we're giving ourselves all these shorthands, but they're actually robbing us of the learning itself.
Yes, I think it's a balancing act, isn't it? I think you need some accountability for schools. I think we've gone far too far now. I think Ofsted needs reforming. I think the school accountability measures need reforming. It's just become too dominant. But I'm not saying you get rid of all that. I just think it's become too one-sided for me.
And now, a short word from the QT founder, Julia Silva.
If you'd like to hear more about the ideas we touch on here, or gain the tools to take your own tutoring to the next level, the Qualification for Tutors could be for you. This live online seminar is facilitated by industry experts who, over 4 Zoom workshops, will cover the foundations of teaching and learning and how it relates to you as a tutor. The workshops are full of rich discussions where you'll learn alongside other tutors and connect on a professional level. We will teach you how to be the kind of tutor every child remembers. Visit our community space at qualifiedtutorcommunity.org and sign up now for our transformative course. We'll see you there.
Now, I welcome the discussion of schools and teachers, but I would like to bring it back to tutoring, as I am wanting to. So, we've talked about feedback in the learning environment. We've talked about mediating the relationship with parents. Maybe we've looked at it more from a school point of view. That's obviously incredibly important as well from a tutor's point of view, including kind of the pressures that the parents put on and the kind of wider management of the student's education that tutors are often put under. We've talked about allowing the student to become an independent learner. Lee, I'd love to ask, drawing it back to, as we mentioned, we'd love to discuss the NTP, perhaps if only briefly, but what are the core skills that tutors must keep in mind when working, and in particular when working as part of this new national programme? What do we want tutors to be thinking about in the forefront of their minds when they help these disadvantaged students?
Well, one of the things that I think is really important, and the evidence backs this up, it is liaising very closely with the school from a tutor's perspective. So, and I see this just from anecdotally, from seeing tutors and being in schools. I know it sounds very obvious, but you've got to be complementing what's going on within the school, and often that doesn't happen. And so I think one of the key things that tutors are going to have to think about in this National Tutoring Programme, again, we were talking earlier, weren't we, about details still to come on that, is how you work with schools. And that works both ways. Of course, schools will have to think about this as well, because I think there's a real power in one-to-one tutoring that could complement what's happening in the classroom. So knowing what's going on in the school. I mean, there's a broader point, isn't there, here about, and it comes back to feedback again, is knowing where your learner is, and talking on getting them to talk to you about where they are in their learning. I do think there's another dimension. I use tutors for my teenage children, well, one of my teenage children, and what you realise is there is a personal chemistry, and I don't have the evidence on this. I don't know what the evidence is, but you certainly need that connection on an emotional level, I find. And what's interesting for me is there was some gaps. There was some evidence on peer-to-peer tutors. So this is when you get school pupils to help other school pupils at primary school. And there seemed to be an optimum gap about 2 years, right? So the older child was still young enough to relate to, but older enough to be respected, right? And it was kind of interesting. What I don't know is what the evidence is later up the age ranges for that. But what I find interesting is that some of the tutors are older enough but they're not as old as me, right? They're not completely ancient, right? So they're just seen as sort of dinosaurs. And I think there's something really interesting about that, about having someone who can connect on some emotional level, but also, of course, on a deeper learning level. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think what you've just been talking about is something that we've been pursuing, ever since the start of this, is facilitating that peer-to-peer support. And several of the students that I tutor, they are involved themselves in tutoring programs within their schools, and I've been involved as part of some of the agencies I work for in mentoring training, and it is really so powerful. And we use that word a lot in education, but watching older students pass on their knowledge that they have acquired from teachers and tutors onto younger students is amazing to see. And in fact, we had on the podcast recently a wonderful friend, Jessie Pizzolides, who's recently set up a mentoring program within her school, where she has gathered her friends and those of her age group to mentor students lower down in the school. And we think that is a really important initiative to support, and we want that to be seen as an example of kind of how that peer-to-peer work can succeed. So that's sort of you've used up one of my questions, Leah. That was going to be my next question, but you've somehow read my mind and seen that was coming. So thank you for answering both. Have we seen that's something that really works? Do you think, Adrian? Is that something that you've supported before, kind of in your experience?
Yeah, it does happen, but it's not. Very formal, really, in the arrangement. It happens in some schools and not in others, and it's one of those things that you utilise the students within your own school. It's incredibly powerful, but it doesn't happen enough. And that's partly the fault of the system, and partly due to the sort of work pressures on staff and students. The pressures on students as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the big thing I would say with all these issues is variation. In schools or among tutors is how you enable those. And I love the idea of some sort of cascade model where, you have good tutoring and then you create good. I mean, I'd love that. That seems to me something that has effect at scale potentially, which is very exciting. As someone been involved in a lot of these national debates, you're always struggling with consistency at scale, right? And that's why when I proposed the National Tutoring Service, as others have, I was arguing for some sort of national infrastructure around that to ensure that there is consistency and that we get high quality tutors across the country. We're still waiting for details on that, but I do think it needs oversight, that National Tutoring Programme.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, as you mentioned, we were discussing this before. We're awaiting more news with bated breath. We're so excited about this program. We're so grateful for you, Lee, for proposing this initially and for continuing to have a role. And we are preparing ourselves to support agencies and organisations as we can as part of this tutor training element that we provide in kind of bringing together a lot of what we've discussed here about promoting independent learners in the students, because beyond this program, there's obviously going to be an end point to this program. We don't want to see that progress lost. We want to see those disadvantaged students come out of this program with much, much more. I mean, the goal is obviously that they come out ahead of where they would be, but we know that there's a lot of this language being used to talk about catching up, which, as we've discussed, can detract from the overall goal. But really, what's been so pleasing for me anyways, is that so much of this what we've discussed here, this knowledge and this experience really does form the basis of our courses and of our teacher training. So it's been very validating to hear that is really the opinions and the leading thoughts at the moment of those industry experts like yourself, Lee. There's really so much more we could discuss, and I'm not just saying that. There is so much more about actual tools.
I've spoken far too much. I'm going to shut up, but it's gone very quickly, hasn't it, this hour?
We'd love to have another go. Adrian, we were talking about having another conversation with Lee where we bring in some of our tutors from all different backgrounds. We thought that might be a really sort of enriching conversation if you'd be willing to do that with us.
Yes, I'm very interested in the other area. I'm sort of interested in tutoring is how you connect to disadvantaged young people. I mean, so there's been lots of debates within schools about this, and lots of models of understanding poverty and all, which can be a bit patronising actually. And you've got a deficit sort of type. Well, you have to be really careful with them. But I'll be interested in views on that actually. Are you as the experts? How do you ensure that you can do tutoring for children that do need it the most, but might not be have the backgrounds that they're used to that kind of engagement? I'd be very interested in views on that.
Yeah, well, that's certainly something that we can start discussing if we haven't already with our network of tutors and those others that we've met along the way, and that Julia and Adrian have known from their experience. I think something that is perhaps a very inspiring part of this conversation is that these things are really coming into the national consciousness now, and that's a really positive step, and hopefully that momentum won't ebb away. I'm mindful that we're coming up to around 50 minutes now, which if this was a school lesson, we'd be expecting students to start dipping in concentration. So let's expect the same of our wonderful listeners. So Lee, thank you so much for making the time to speak to us. There's really been so much in there. Julia and Adrian, wonderful contributions again. Thank you so much. And we all look forward to more progress in the National Tutoring Programme. So thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Lee.
Thanks, Ludo.
Okay, see you all next time. Thank you. Bye. Thanks for listening to the Qualified Tutor Podcast, where tutors share their expertise to support the tutoring community. If you'd like to continue the conversation, join our Qualified Tutor Community at www.qualifiedtutorcommunity.org or find it in the show notes below. We exist to connect, share, and learn with you because tutoring is a small job that makes a big difference.